Why do we tell children stories? Now, when I mean children, I'm talking about before they have actually got to know anything about the world. Why do we tell them stories? Because presumably when you tell someone a story, once upon a time there was a chicken that tried to cross a road. Presumably you are assuming that they've already experienced a chicken, a road, and trying to cross it, right? So why do we tell children stories before they've experienced the things in the stories that we're telling them about? We begin with, for want of a better word, a chaos. A friend of mine said about children that they see upside down. I write that, I've got that written on my wall. Children see upside down. They begin with a chaos, and then we tell them stories, and then they live a life that encompasses those stories. So the stories, in a way, are pre-codes. They're codes before living. They are shapes that we make, that we give them, with which to organize the chaos of existence and of life and of growing up and of time and of psychological experience. The point I'm trying to draw your attention to here is that storytelling is one of the most human things that we do. It is, I would say, from every tradition that I'm aware of, stories preceded every form of technology that we know of. Stories preceded every form of religion that we know of. We tell stories to ourselves the minute we wake up from sleep. The act of waking up itself is, as it were, the beginning of a story. From the moment you are born into a world of stories. You are born into a story. Being born is itself the beginning of a story. Everything else that we do from birth to death is one vast cosmic story in which there are many micro stories. Why do we tell children stories? I'm going to keep going back to that same point, because that's the point at which we are all the time. Why do we tell children stories? Because we live stories, because the way we shape our lives itself is a story, and the story shapes the life. It's a mutual relationship, as it were, between the experience and the coding of that experience in narrative terms, and then that coding going on to affect the experience. This is from The Joys of Storytelling that I published in 1996. To poison a nation, poison its stories. A demoralized nation tells demoralized stories to itself. To poison a nation, poison its stories. In ancient Greece, they sent off a figure to their oracle because there were troubles in the land. What should we do to save our future? The oracle came back with the strangest advice. Put stories in the ears of your children. Put stories in the ears of your children. I've thought about that oracle, and I've thought about the implication of that remark. Put stories in the ears of your children. The Greeks, the ancient Greeks, taught their children the stories of the gods. The myths were stories that were planted into their children very early. When Alexander the Great set out on his conquest of the known and the unknown world, he took with him one book, which he had under his pillow, and whenever he carried it around, he put it in a golden casket. It was the Iliad of Homer. He lived his entire life following the model of Achilles. He'd been doing this since he was a child. It was something that Aristotle, who was his teacher, had taught him to do. Stories are pre-models of existence. I can't say that, I can't stress that strongly enough. Everybody is a world of stories. But within that matrix of world of stories, there are predominant stories. It's the predominant stories that shape our psychology. In a sense, you could say that one's psychology is the inward story of our psyches. When I ask everyone to tell their stories, this is what I was interested in. I was interested in how people perceive themselves from within. I was interested in the shape that we have given to our experience. As a novelist, one of my jobs is actually to go around listening to people's stories. And something keeps coming back to me. Great eras are eras in which great stories are lived and told. Great leaders understand the power of stories that they project to their people. They understand that stories can change an age, can turn an era around. They understand that the people are as healthy and as confident as the stories they tell themselves. They understand that without fighting, stories have won over more people than all the great wars put together. So the question, I suppose, that's at the back of your minds is this. If I change the nature of the story by which I live, do I change my life? And is this true? Even if the story that I've chosen to live, as it were, goes against the grain of society? In other words, what is the relationship between the story that one tells oneself, about oneself, and moral truth, or the truth of the world in which we live? What is the relationship between them? I am interested in the stories that nations tell themselves. The stories that corporations tell themselves. The stories that families tell themselves. I've been around to a couple of friends' families for dinner. And after listening for a while, just come to realize that here's a family that tells itself stories that are defensive. Its mythologies are defensive mythologies. I've been to families that have victorious mythologies. You listen to them around the table, how fathers and mothers, the stories they tell around Christmas. And sooner or later, a mythology appears. Every story you tell about yourself reveals you. If you're feeling bad and you say, oh, I'm feeling great, the I am feeling great still reveals I'm feeling bad. Every story you tell reveals you. Stories do not conceal. Stories reveal. Their natural tendency is to reveal. When you use stories to conceal, actually you reveal more in your concealing stories. It's the strangest thing about stories, that ultimate transparency. Because stories are traitors, because stories work outward and inward in their truth, they compel us to face our truths. I suppose facing our truth is one of the hardest things that we do as human beings. It's one of the most difficult things. I suppose that's why in the Greek myth of the Gorgon, the mirror was used to look at the Gorgon, because we're not capable of facing the mirror of truth directly ourselves. The story is the mirror by which we look at our truths. If you read the story of any era carefully enough, you can tell what will be happening to that people in 10, 15, 20 years' time. In a sense, the very nature of what we are, contrary to the laws of physics, the implication of our future is already here, now. When two friends meet, if they haven't met for a long time, one of the first things they say to one another is, "Hey, what you been doing?" It's a way of saying, "Tell me your story." One friend says, "Oh, I've been doing great. Been all around the world, been having fun." The other friend says, "Actually, I've not been doing so great. I've been depressed, and I've been at home, and I've attempted suicide 2 or 3 times." When the two friends leave, the one who was suicidal feels that less suicidal. And the one who'd been traveling feels that less like traveling. Why? Because when we tell stories to one another about ourselves, we exchange our matrices. It is not possible to encounter the story of someone else and not be impinged on by it one way or another. So stories are infectious. People think that you need to speak before your story becomes apparent. But your story is all that you are. It's right there as you appear to be, and even as you do not appear to be. So story is also the magic revealing gap between appearance and reality. The appearance of a thing and the reality of the thing. For many years, we in Britain, the government, gave the impression that the economy was fine and everything was under control. And suddenly, we're told there's a recession. Which is true? Which is true? That it was fine back then when they said it was fine, and that suddenly there has been a time illusion recession? I'd say the truth is that it was not fine all along. But if you had listened deeply enough, you would have heard that things were not well. So stories teach us to listen deeply, to listen below the surface. Why do we tell children stories? We are the children that we tell stories. And I'm going to reverse that. Why don't we ask our children to tell us stories? We learn a lot more about them. When we tell them stories, we prepare. We, in a sense, shape them. But when they tell us stories, they liberate themselves. They shape themselves. They shape their world. They shape their day. They shape what's happened to them. The exaggeration that you talk about is actually an important part of storytelling. It's the nature of the human mind to, when telling, to exaggerate. It's a way of, as it were, making larger something that we experience and want to make sense of. It's one of the traditional ways that human beings do it. Around any campfire around the world you want to talk about, nobody will tell you a story as it actually happened. I can't stress it strongly enough. Stories and the nature of storytelling and the living of stories and the fact of stories is hardwired into our psychology. The minute we have absorbed a story, we have, as it were, rerouted something in our psychological hardwiring. One story can transform the psychology of a people. Overnight. Churchill did that at the time of the war. What he effectively did was, in his personality and in his speeches, he told a story. Not that we're going to be defeated, but we will be victorious. He told a story. And what a story does is it helps you to see. And the minute you can see, you can do. Are you all absolutely sure? Are you all absolutely sure of the reality of the world? Are you absolutely sure that you're not, it's just quite possible that this is a mutual dream that we're having? We know that in dreams things are just as real. So how do you know for a fact that we are in a separate reality? I'm not saying that we are, I'm just putting a little question mark, because I have an intuition that the fundamental nature of life is tinged with a little bit of unreality. I've heard people who've had dreams in which they've dreamt 100 years. They've lived for 100 years, events, great magnitude of time, and they've slept for 5 minutes. So there's something in the nature of consciousness, something in the nature of our consciousness bends our reality. What I'm trying to say is that reality is not absolute. Reality bends just a little bit from the impact of our presence here, our stories, our actions, our thoughts, and our consciousness. We bend reality just that little bit. And one of the bending factors is the story we tell ourselves. We are victim of the great structures of stories that we tell ourselves. And people who make quantum leaps are people who break through those stories, or who never believed in those stories in the first place, or who saw through them, or who glimpsed a greater story. Great leaders tell their nations fictions that alter their perceptions. All the great religions, all the great prophets found it necessary to spread their message through stories, fables, and parables. Stories are either dangerous or liberating because they are a kind of destiny. The fact of storytelling hints at a fundamental human unease, hints at human imperfection. Where there is perfection, there is no story to tell. We are part human, part stories. Stories work both ways. The stories we project, that we live, and the stories that impact upon us in whatever community that we're part of. I think it's our job to constantly question our stories. Whether we know it or not, at any given point, we're muttering stories to ourselves inside our heads all the time. You're going to going to a meeting to give a presentation. Oh, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. They're not going to like me. They're not going to like me. Oh my God, they're going to be difficult. They're going to be tough. Oh wow. Oh goodness. Last time I did this, it wasn't so great. Oh my goodness. Okay, pull yourself together, Ben. We're constantly muttering. There's a constant stream of a radio broadcast of stories in our head and in our consciousness. The other thing I'd like to talk about in my summation is to be conscious of the stories that we are told. And stories come in 100 different forms. They don't always come once upon a time. Stories can come in statistics. They can come from authority figures. They can come in the form of, this has always been the case. All of these forms are stories. Anything that affects our perception of the world usually comes in the form of a story. Be aware of the stories that we imbibe. Question them. I think it's probably better if one's truth, if one's story is luminous than if it's not. Like your kids. Even after we've faced the facts, even after the facts seem to be impossible, I think it does us good in our stories to say, how do your kids end their stories?
Oh, it's always fantastic.
It'll be great. It'll be great.